Hi folks, how you doing? It's James, JT at the movies. Welcome back to Debriefing 007. It's been 2 years since I've done one of these episodes. 2 full years since I've talked about a James Bond film in its entirety. I know I did about a year ago to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the franchise. I did the little recap on the alternate TV cut of On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is a video that's done quite well on my channel. And you'll be able to find a link to that down below if you want to give that a watch. But today we're here to talk about the unofficial James Bond film from 1983, where Sean Connery reprised his role as James Bond for one final time. Never Say Never Again. So we're finally talking about Never Say Never Again. Can you believe it? I never thought I'd actually get round to this one, and I'm representing as well. I'm wearing my Thunderball t-shirt, so there you go as well. It only felt appropriate to wear this one for that. But before we talk about the plot of Never Say Never Again and what I think about the actual film itself, I think it's really important that we delve into the history and the backstory of this film, because it's got such an interesting history and pre-production as this film that I could probably make just an entire video about that without even touching on the plot of the film. So let's dive into that, shall we? Never Say Never Again's story begins where the novel of Thunderball's story begins in the late 50s. Fleming was desperate to bring his literary hero James Bond to the silver screen, and one of the many conversations that he had in the late 50s was with producer, writer Kevin McClory and also writer Jack Whittingham, and the three of them, that trio, got together and wrote a screenplay, a treatment if you like, for a project called Longitude 78 West, which had all the basic plot elements of Thunderball, the nuclear bombs being stolen, Blofeld, SPECTRE, etc. But due to costs and loads of other mitigating factors, basically the project didn't go anywhere. Fleming was one that didn't like to waste any ideas and turned the premise of this treatment that they'd written into his 1961 novel Thunderball, but didn't credit Whittingham or McClory for their efforts and involvement on the original treatment that the novel was based. So, of course, McClory sued Fleming and managed to win the film rights to the story of Thunderball, as well as certain character rights like Blofeld and the agency of SPECTRE. This caused a bit of a problem, as the Eon films had started production by the time these legal battles were going on, with Dr. No and From Russia with Love already out. Albert Broccoli and Harry Saltzman quickly made a deal with Kevin McClory that he could be the sole producer of the fourth official James Bond film, Thunderball, and that they would be credited as presenters. But in so doing, McClory would not be able to make his own James Bond film for at least 10 years with the rights that he held. In the 1970s, after the 10 years had lapsed, McClory started working with Harry Palmer's scribe Len Deighton and also with Sean Connery to draft their own version of Thunderball, tentatively titled James Bond of the Secret Service, though that title was later scrapped as lawyers had deemed that it was too close to Eon's On Her Majesty's Secret Service. The challenge that McClory and co had is that they could only adapt from the novel of Thunderball and couldn't take any elements that were introduced in the film Thunderball by Eon Productions. And they kept having loads of legal troubles because the script kept having to be checked by lawyers and insurance people just to make sure that it wasn't going to cause them any sort of legal troubles later down the line. And they found this to be a real challenge. One bonus that McClory did have, though, is, as I previously mentioned, because he owned the rights to Blofeld and SPECTRE, they could feature in his story, which was not something that had been able to happen in the official series since 1971's Diamonds Are Forever, the last film to officially feature Blofeld, though die-hard Bond fans will know that there was a bit of a nod and a wink to this ongoing legal battle in For Your Eyes Only, where Roger Moore is seen visiting the grave of his wife Tracy, and then a bald-headed villain with a white cat who remains unnamed is then comedically dispatched of by Bond. And speaking of Eon Productions, of course, they continually challenged the production and the writing of this film in the courts, as understandably they were worried that a rival James Bond film, or maybe even a rival James Bond series, would have a disastrous impact on their ongoing franchise as well, especially if the rumours were to be believed that Sean Connery was coming back. And of course, as we know, Sean Connery did sign on to reprise his role as James Bond when Irving Kershner came on board as director. In 1980, Jack Schwartzman came on board as the producer. Now, he was really intrigued by the idea of being able to produce an entirely independent James Bond film without sort of studio interference, as it were, or studio involvement. And because of obviously McClory's rights, they were able to do that. But his role as producer was not really a typical one. He spent most of his time using his previous skills and training as a lawyer in courts or with the insurers of the film, making sure again that they were jumping through the relevant legal loopholes that they needed to do to make sure that this film didn't breach any of the copyright agreements set out by the Eon Productions team and the rights that McClory had. It's a real convoluted mess, is the pre-production of this film, and it's amazing given all the hoops that they had to jump through and the struggles and the overrunning budgets and things that the film even came out. And in fact, they go so far as to say on the commentary of the film, Irving Kershner does with the film historian, that had Sean Connery not have been attached to play James Bond, the film would have probably died a death in pre-production because there wouldn't have been that drive there to make the film. Jack Schwartzman was inspired by the presidential debates between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan in 1980 and an ongoing nuclear crisis at that time to make sure that the script was reverted back to, at its core, the nuclear terrorism plot. This meant that the scripts that Len Deighton had been working on with Sean Connery and with Kevin McClory were thrown out, and that veteran TV and film writer, probably best known for his work on the Batman '66 show, Lorenzo Semple Jr., was brought in to write a treatment for the film. Lorenzo wrote a film that largely resembles the film that we have today, though with a lot more action set pieces. Director Irving Kershner, though, desperate to keep the budget down as it was already spiralling out of control, axed a lot of these scenes, and the two had a somewhat bitter parting of the ways. At this point, Sean Connery then recruited Dick Clements and Ian La Frenais, who were probably best known for working on British sitcoms such as Porridge, to come in and brush up some of the dialogue and some of the script that Lorenzo Semple had written. Clement and La Frenais would go on to say that more or less the first 40 minutes of the film and the character of Nigel Small-Fawcett and a lot of the dialogue seen throughout is their contribution to the film. You can definitely tell that it was the right thing to do to try and include a touch of humour and tongue-in-cheek, and as Irving Kershner likes to say about the film himself, you know, a touch of satire, as that's what the James Bond films had largely become by the 1980s, and the films with Roger Moore, love them as much as I do, I would say they're closer to being comedies than they are the gritty action espionage films of the early 60s with Sean Connery. It's interesting to note as well that the title of this film, Never Say Never Again, came from a conversation between Sean Connery and his wife. He'd said after Diamonds Are Forever that he would never play the character of James Bond again, having only reprised it in that film for a record-breaking salary of $1.2 million and a 2-picture deal at the Studio United Artists, which was unheard of at the time. He'd said he would never reprise the role, and his wife said, well, never say never. When they were thinking about what to call this film during the production, they recalled that conversation with Connery's wife and that she'd said never say never, and the title stuck, and thus we have Never Say Never Again. The film was originally supposed to release in the summer of 1983 and go directly head-to-head with the official entry Octopussy, starring Roger Moore, who coincidentally was also coaxed back to come back for that film, as Eon Productions were terrified of the thought of introducing a new Bond and then having it go head-to-head with a returning Sean Connery. But again, due to production delays and the ongoing legal battles that Jack Schwartzman was constantly battling while the film was shooting at its various locations around the globe, they were unable to meet that release date, and it ended up being released later in 1983. This didn't stop the press, however, from dubbing this as the Battle of the Bonds. It's often been said that this film was such a bizarre film to be involved in because it was made out of almost, I suppose you could say, spite, and the fact that there was this legal loophole that was there to be sort of capitalised on and exploited. And it's just not something that's really been sort of done since. And obviously now that the rights are well and truly back with Eon Productions and their shareholders, it's not something that we're ever likely going to see again happen in our lifetimes. Let's take a look at the plot, shall we? Now, normally the James Bond films would open with the gun barrel sequence where Bond walks on, shoots the camera, and the blood comes down the screen. But of course, We can't do that this time because this isn't an official James Bond film made by Eon Productions, and Kevin McClory and Irving Kershner didn't have the rights to use any of the iconography that is traditionally associated with James Bond. Now, they got round this by having the screen filled with lots of little 007s and then having the action of the film sort of come through the zeros as they got bigger and bigger and bigger. The film then opens into an action sequence where Bond is rescuing a young girl from some mercenaries in the jungle, whilst one of the worst Bond songs, probably one of the worst songs ever put to film, plays over the top of it. Never Say Never Again, sang by Lani Hall and written by the film's composer Michel Legrand, is just a complete misfire for what this film, needed. It needed an upbeat rock song for that sequence, and really just to sort of pack a bit of a punch, but no, it's an adult contemporary jazz ballad. And it's bloody awful. I appreciate that they couldn't do the whole John Barry, Monty Norman thing, and they were probably really limited in terms of like the copyright behind the scenes as to how close to the original sound that they got. But what they went for here just really doesn't work, and it is only a detriment to the film's final finished product. Bond then rescues the young lady, but it turns out she's a double agent and she stabs him. But before we can even have a chance to react to that, we then cut back to M's office. We're introduced to this film's new M, played by Edward Fox. Now, he's a really sort of stuck-up and bureaucratic young M, as opposed to the sort of the old and wise Bernard Lee character that we're used to. And we're also led to believe that this character, played by Edward Fox, is the successor of that previous M, and that Sean Connery's Bond is later on in his career. This new M really doesn't have much respect for Bond and doesn't hold his skills in high regard at all, and is doing nothing but chastise him as they watch the action replay of the training exercise. M orders that Bond go to Shrubland's health spa for a radical regime of diet and exercise to detox himself and to get himself back into a state where he's good for active service. We then cut to a great scene as we're introduced to this film's femme fatale, Fatima Blush, played by Barbara Carrera, as she's walking through a bank in France down into one of the boardrooms where we're introduced to this film's version of SPECTRE. It's here that we meet the sort of the ringleader of SPECTRE, Ernst Blofeld, this time played and wasted by Max von Sydow. He turns up for this scene and one other little bit later in the film, and it's just an absolute waste of a great actor. And then we meet the film's main villain, which is Spectre number 2, Maximilian Largo, not Emilio Largo this time, played by Klaus Maria Brandauer. And the producers and director went for an intentional choice of to not make him as wacky or as zany as some of the Bond villains that were coming out contemporary to this, like Jaws and whoever else, and they wanted to make him a much more down-to-earth businessman who just had a real sort of evil flair about him. And I would say largely they succeeded in that because he is one of the best parts of the film. We then cut back to Bond going to Shrublands, and he's put on this diet and he's put on this exercise regime, and he's really not having a great time of it. But of course, in true Bond fashion, he's snuck in a briefcase full of goodies that he's eating and drinking when he's not being watched, and he's seducing the nurses left and right. Typical Bond stuff. And Connery just eases back into this just absolutely effortlessly. In fact, I would go so far as to say, and I think many would agree with me, that he's better as James Bond in this film, despite the film's flaws, than he is in Diamonds Are Forever, his last official appearance as Bond. While he's in the health spa, Bond spots Fatima Blush posing as a nurse, abusing and not really taking good care of one of the so-called patients, Jack Patacci, who is a US naval pilot. It turns out that Patacci is being bribed to help Spectre steal nuclear missiles from the US Air Force, otherwise they're going to kill his sister, Domino, this film's leading lady, played by Kim Basinger. They've also got him hooked on heroin so that he'll do anything that they say because they're going to keep him in a constant supply of the drugs. Bond goes to spy on Fatima and Jack Patacci and gets seen by Fatima, which then leads on to this film's version of Count Lippy, played by Pat Roach, who folks will remember as one of the heavies in the first 3 Indiana Jones films. Bond and Lippy have a really interesting and comedic fight through the health spa where they're absolutely just trashing the place, and it really shows Bond's age and that he's not able to keep up to the fight with these guys. All the while, the other residents have absolutely no idea what's going on. In fact, there's one scene where Bond and Lippy are fighting behind them, but the World Cup's playing and all the other residents are doing is cheering for the football. In the end, Bond ends up getting the upper hand by partially blinding him with a sample of his own urine in a jar, which causes Lippy to back in into a cabinet full of glass and chemicals and whatever, and gets stabbed to death and poisoned from all the contents of the cabinet and the glass. It's quite an amusing scene, and it's one that those writers from Porridge that I mentioned earlier contributed to the film. I think it is one of the stronger scenes of the film, to be fair. Petacci is then able to steal the bombs from the US naval base by using a retinal scan of the president's eye that he's had grafted into his own eye, and that's why he was recuperating in the hospital. Once he's successfully done this and the bombs are with Spectre, Fatima kills him in a really over-the-top fashion where she throws a snake into his car so that it'll crash his car, and then goes and puts a bomb in his car and blows him up. You'd figure that they just put the bomb in his car, but theatricality must count for something in Spectre, I guess. But once Petacci is being killed, Blofeld then sends his ransom demands to NATO, at which point M is ordered to reinstate the double O's. Bond finds a matchbook in Petacci's room at the health spa that bears the logo of Maximilian Largo's company, and realises that there must be a connection between the hijacking of the bombs and Largo, and sets about investigating this. This takes Bond over to the Bahamas, where Bond meets Fatima Blush for the first time in person, and they agree to go on a diving expedition, which I'll come back to in a moment. But we also meet Nigel Small-Fawcett, played by none other than Mr. Bean himself, Rowan Atkinson. And again, this is a character that Clements and Frenay put into the film, and he's comedic relief, but it doesn't work. He's funny, but it just doesn't work. One thing that does work about the scene, though, is that Sean Connery plays it completely straight and doesn't play any of it for laughs, whilst Rowan Atkinson is this usual sort of typical bumbling buffoon that he quite often plays. Bond then goes on his diving expedition with Fatima, and the two have sex in one of the weirdest sex scenes that you'd probably ever see in a James Bond film. And then they go diving together, and then she sets a shark that's controlled by radio antennas onto Bond and leaves him presumed dead at the bottom of the ocean. Bond manages to escape and surfaces near the fishing boat of a young lady that he was flirting with at the pier before he met Small-Fawcett and Fatima earlier. The two of them decide that they're going to go back to their hotel and have a romantic encounter of their own. Fatima, realising that Bond's survived, goes and plants a bomb directly under his bed in his hotel room, and we see the hotel room explode. It's then that we learn that Bond's gone back to the other lady's hotel room rather than his own, and makes the quip, "Well, we made the right choice." About what? Your place or mine? The film then shifts its focus over to France, where the majority of the rest of the film, I would say, takes place. And we're introduced to the character of Nicole, who is Interpol, and is there to assist Bond, as well as Felix Leiter, this time played by Bernie Casey. And I would say that he's one of the strongest versions of Felix Leiter that we've had in the series, you know, be it official or unofficial. Him and Sean Connery have a really great on-screen chemistry when they're together, and you can believe that they're colleagues and that they're friends. Bond then starts to surveil Domino, and in a really creepy scene that's aged like milk, he poses as a masseuse in a health spa and gives her a massage while sort of gently interrogating her about why she's in town and who she's with, and basically just confirming what he already knows. And then he disappears before a real masseuse turns up to give Domino her actual massage. And then there's the sort of the really creepy scene, and I can even remember being a kid and thinking, that's not quite right, is it? Domino goes, well, where did the monsieur go? And the real masseuse goes, well, I don't know, he doesn't work here. We then cut forward to the evening where Domino had told Bond that Largo's hosting a charity event at the local casino, so Bond then decides that he's going to sneak in and infiltrate the event. Now, I will stand by this next statement. The scene where Bond sneaks in and breaks into the casino and ambushes the guard on the door and gives him the cigarette case and tells him it's a gyroscopic bomb is one of the best scenes in all Bond. I don't care that it's not in an official James Bond film. It is peak Connery. It is peak James Bond sort of humour and satire, and the right level of sort of, you know, tension in the scene as well. And it's just brilliant, and I absolutely love it. You could have put that scene in Goldfinger or You Only Live Twice or one of the Roger Moore efforts, and it would not be out of place. I adore that scene. Great little scene. Bond then catches up with Domino inside and apologises and sort of explains that, you know, sort of what his intentions were, sort of thing. But before he can chat to her in any level of detail about what he knows about her brother and the plot that's going on, Largo comes over and introduces himself. The two then end up playing Largo's new video game for donations to charity, World Domination, which is a game essentially where they're basically trying to shoot each other's armies on a game screen, but if they lose, they get an electric shock. Whilst he loses at first, Bond ultimately wins the game, and rather than having Largo pay out the money, he says, "I'll settle for a dance with Domino." And so the two go and have a really awkward dance scene, and the directors and the producers have said in the behind-the-scenes stuff that Connery really couldn't dance, and bless him, he tries his hardest, but yeah, you could tell he's really awkward and stiff in this particular scene. And it's the scene that they use to tell Domino that her brother's been killed by Largo and his men. And it's meant to be really tense and sort of bitter and sort of, you know, full of emotion. And it's not, it's just laughable. And then we get the following scene where Largo goes, "Right, you can go and kill Bond," and sends Fatima on her way to go and kill him. She goes back to Bond's villa and kills Nicole, which then prompts a motorcycle chase from Bond. And Bond's chasing Fatima through all the different streets of France. And then they finally corner Bond, and it looks like all's lost when Fatima says, "Before I kill you, I'm going to have you write a note declaring that I was the greatest sex of your life," sort of thing. Bond, using a rocket launcher pen that he got from this version's Q earlier in the film, manages to blow her up in a rather comedic scene. He's then sort of rescued, if you like, and helped out of the situation by Felix before the French authorities can get there and decipher what's gone on. Bond and Felix then try to swim aboard Largo's yacht, as they believe that's where the bombs are. Bond manages to get aboard, but Felix doesn't, and ends up having to swim back to shore. Bond's welcomed aboard as though he's a guest, which is quite unnerving, I would say, and he meets up with Largo and says hello, and there's pleasantries exchanged, but Largo hasn't quite revealed his true colours yet. Bond then meets up with Domino in her dance studio and realises that there's a two-way mirror and that they're being surveilled by Largo. Decides that he's going to kiss her. So the two share a kiss, and of course it provokes Largo, who then reveals his true self. And he takes the pair to his house in North Africa, Palmyra, where he fully reveals his intentions of blowing up the oil fields and also blowing up the president in Washington with the nuclear bombs. He then chains Bond up in the dungeon in his house and takes Domino down to the market to be sold as a slave to the local traders. Bond manages to escape and manages to save Domino from the market, and they escape on horseback. They then ride the horse over a castle wall, off a cliff, into the sea. And that very scene, ladies and gents, boys and girls, folks at home, is why films now carry the disclaimer in the credits to say that no animals were harmed during the making of this film. Bond and Domino then reunite with Felix and the US Navy, and they manage to locate the bomb that's in Washington and make sure that the president is safe. But they've yet to find the other bomb destined for blowing up the oil fields of the Middle East. Bond, realising that a pendant that Domino wears that Largo had given her earlier in the film marries up with a cove near where they are on the map, that is the key to where the bombs are. They line it up with the map, and of course they realise exactly where Largo's base of operations are. Bond, Felix and the Navy storm the cave. They manage to find the other bomb, and there is what's meant to be, I would say, a tense underwater battle that really doesn't carry, and it's just, you know, sort of slow motion and fighting and whatever, and it's sort of, this is where the film really does lose a lot of its, you know, a lot of its sort of oomph, if you like. But where it looks like Bond's about to be triumphed, Largo is then shot with a spear, and it's revealed that Domino has swam down and come and killed him as revenge for the murder of her brother. We then cut to the epilogue of this film, where it's revealed that Bond and Domino are now together as a couple, and that James Bond has retired from the Secret Service. He vows that he will never again work for the British Secret Service, as the character of Nigel Small-Fawcett sneaks into their house and ends up getting thrown into the pool by Bond, as Small-Fawcett pleads with him to come back, as the fate of the modern world might be at stake. Bond again reiterates, nope, never again, and then the film closes to the end credits. So what did I think of this film? Well, it's not very good, is it? But I enjoy certain aspects of it. I enjoy the performance of Largo from Klaus Maria Brandauer. I enjoy seeing Sean Connery back as James Bond, and I enjoy seeing him actually enjoying playing James Bond in this one as well. And that's about where it ends for me. You know, the score, as I mentioned earlier, by Michel Legrand, is something that rightly comes under scrutiny because it just doesn't fit the sort of the theme of this film and the vibe of this film. It's completely out of place. I mean, like the motorcycle chase that I mentioned just a moment ago, and it's got this real sort of like jazz suite going on, and it almost feels like a TV movie in a sense, and it just really doesn't work whatsoever. And I think they would have been better getting a composer to do something more action based. Critics at the time were largely pleased to see Sean Connery back and gave the film favourable reviews. However, as the years have gone on and it's had time to sort of sit with people and let them digest it, the film really has fallen out of grace and is not fondly remembered as one of the better James Bond entries. And again, whilst it was a financial success, the official entry that came out that year, Octopussy, went on to gross more money at the box office. In the wake of this film, Kevin McClory tried to make more and more adaptations of Thunderball and subsequent films using the rights that he had to the Thunderball story and the characters within it, and these kept getting shut down all the time. There were a few times where he got close. He nearly came close in the 90s to making another version of Thunderball called Warhead, where he was even looking at having the likes of maybe Mel Gibson or Liam Neeson play the role. He even approached Timothy Dalton to come back and do a third unofficial James Bond film, but Dalton again rightly declined. In 1997, the distribution rights were returned to Eon Productions' parent company at the time, MGM. So MGM now owned the distribution rights to all James Bond films. However, they still didn't have Kevin McClory's character and story rights, meaning that they couldn't make any films featuring Blofeld or Spectre or use any elements from the story of Thunderball. However, in 2013, after McClory's death, his family sold the rights back to Eon Productions, which meant that they were then able to start including elements in 2015's Spectre, which featured the organisation of Spectre and the character of Blofeld returning to the film for the first time in 44 years. For anyone interested, I've obviously gone into little tidbits of information about the pre-production of this film and some of the things that happened after the film came out and about the rights returning and you know, whatever else. There is a much more in-depth and involved story there than I've covered in this video, and more so in fact than other YouTubers have probably covered, though the likes of Calvin Dyson and David Zaritsky and Dutch Bond Fan have done some really great videos that I'm sure if you're watching this you've probably already seen, but if you haven't, go and check them out. However, if you wanted to do your own bit of research and reading and sort of bone up on what went on, there is this fantastic book, The Battle for Bond, which really goes into all the details and the nitty-gritty of the legal battles from the writing of Thunderball onwards to Never Say Never coming out again. So it's definitely worth checking out if you've not read that book. So I suppose to recap, really, this film is an interesting footnote, an interesting chapter, if you like, in the life and times of the cinematic James Bond, and I suppose to a degree the literary James Bond as well. It's interesting as a sort of a curiosity and something, like I say, that I would watch maybe every once in a blue moon if I'm doing a watch through, or to watch it essentially for research purposes for the likes of making videos like this. But it's never a film that I would just sort of go and grab off the shelf and you know, think, oh, I'll watch Never Say Never Again tonight because I'm in the mood for it. And that's a real shame because it's obviously Sean Connery's final appearance on screen as James Bond, and I think, you know, given the rights they had and the opportunity that they had in front of them, they could have done so much more with it and made such a better film than what they did, but they were so desperately trying to clone the Eon Productions and then having to jump through all the hoops to avoid the legal repercussions that they ended up sort of tying themselves in a corner when they could have done something really clever and really unique with it. For me, I would go and rate this film as a 5 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching. It's been really great to make this Debriefing 007 video for you again and return to this world of 007. It's a shame that there's not much coming out in the world of 007 at the moment, so I've not really got much to talk about there. And obviously, as I'm not a 007 dedicated channel, I don't really want to start getting into making loads of little videos about, you know, tidbits of this and that and the other. So I suppose we'll have to wait for another Bond film to come out before there'll be another entry into this series. But thank you so much for watching. I've really enjoyed making this video. I hope you guys have enjoyed watching it. Leave it a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it. Please get involved in the comments and let me know your thoughts on Never Say Never Again, your thoughts on this video. And if you're coming across me for the first time with this video, hi, nice to meet you. Please think about subscribing. It means the world to me and of course helps my channel to grow as well. Above all else, folks, take care of yourselves and I will see you again real soon for my next video. Bye for now.